thanks, Greg. When we were talking, I took some time and I reflected on two of probably the most successful culture transformation programs that I've been involved in. And when I really distill it down, it started with beliefs. So one of the programs was the ANZ Breakout Culture Transformation Program. So at the time, in the late 80s, early 90s, ANZ was going broke. They were shutting branches, getting rid of people, share price had bottomed out, and in came a new CEO, and he ran this program called Breakout. And 6 years later, Bank of the Year, 6 years in a row, high engagement scores, etc. And I was thinking about what underpinned that. And it was a belief that John McFarland had that people have the capacity to be complete at work. So that was the underlying belief. And we framed that up as bring the whole person to work and take the whole person home again. So that was in the financial services sector. The second large transformation that I worked in is in infrastructure and construction, a $16 billion national organization. And I thought about the belief, and the belief actually was that good safety is not the absence of negative indicators or unwanted events. So just because we're not having hazards, near misses, incidents, environmental, that doesn't mean we're safe. Good safety is actually the presence of positive events. And that belief then got the organization through a stage where they got rid of measuring completely lead indicators as a measure of safety. It's called the TRIFA in construction, total recordable injury frequency rate, and replaced that with measuring the presence of positives. So two big successful culture transformations. And my reflection was the action only came after the belief was actually put in stone. So you need the belief first before you even start to drive actions, change behaviors, look at what you measure. So to me, that's why belief is really important when we talk about psychosocial safety and psychosocial hazards. And I know it's really close to your heart as well. So perhaps you want to share with our audience just an overview of your take on psychosocial hazards and where we sit with that.
So, Pete, the topic of this conversation, of this thing, is are our beliefs creating psychosocial hazards? So, when I have this conversation with people sort of kind of almost do a double take. So, how can my beliefs actually create a hazard for myself or someone else? So maybe you could open our minds to that and give us an insight into how that actually works. Because sometimes I think when I talk, and we got a lot of thumbs up from the chat, but sometimes we believe what we're doing is right, but it's not always the case.
Yeah, well, this is true. And you mentioned the 14 categories of psychosocial hazards, and I just reflect immediately on what's the belief out there. And my concern is that what I'm hearing as a belief is it's going to generate a new raft of compliance. We spend $256 billion in this country on compliance already per annum. We have 1 in 10 people working in enforcing compliance. And I'm hearing a lot of that out there. And to your point of we should just be doing good business practice, 2 weeks ago, the right to disconnect legislation was passed in Australia. And I was thinking, if you had the right leadership and the right culture, would you even need to legislate? But we legislate for the lowest common denominator. And so there is a duty now in organizations to identify, assess, control, manage, review those controls with psychosocial hazards exactly the same way that you would as if it was a physical hazard. And this, for me, is creating a lot of fear and beliefs around that. And one of the things that really brings us out is Oxford University did a survey. It was published last year. The article is called The $8 Billion Con. And so what they did was they looked at over 44,000 workers across 240 odd different industries. And they looked at companies that spent money on well-being and companies that didn't spend money on well-being. And when they looked at the two cohorts, what they found is where money had been spent on well-being, people were actually no better off. And in many cases, they were worse off. So the article then goes on to say, well, what are all the flaws in current well-being strategies and beliefs, I might add? And one of them is that everything moves into blame shifting. So leaders will say, people are the problem, we've got to get the people right. as opposed to we need to take an organizational approach or have an organizational belief around this. There's a wonderful quote by a Belgian called Alex Den Heyer, and he says, when a flower is wilting, you don't fix the flower, you fix the garden. So, of course, who's responsible for the garden or the environment that we operate in? It is our leaders. So in terms of beliefs, I think back to the work I've done in safety, and in particular, the shift in the safety world, which enabled the culture transformation program I spoke about earlier. Traditional thinking has always been people are a problem that we need to manage and control. Now, if that's a belief that's held, I could put money on that's going to cause some psychosocial hazards in the workplace. Whereas if you flip that, people are not a problem to manage and control, but you take on a belief that people are actually the solution. They have the answers, they have the ideas if we get curious and engage and we consult with them. Another belief is, as I mentioned earlier, that good safety is the absence of negative events or unwanted events. Just because we don't have anything recorded or reported doesn't really mean we're safe. It probably means people aren't reporting. So there's a belief, again, that can drive negative outcomes. And the third one is, as I'm hearing out there, we need to force compliance on everybody. So hence this whole raft of compliance that's going to come out. And then that becomes a very meaningless, bureaucratic, top-down activity, whereas a healthier belief would be, how can we engage everyone in this, where it makes sense to people and they see value in it as well. So I think sometimes at a base level, beliefs can actually create more hazards, create anxiety, and create uncertainty in the workplace. And, there's two parts to this conversation. I think you and I have spoken, Greg. As organizations, we need to fulfill our basic requirements around compliance and have psychosocial hazard risk registers. But to me, that's just the entry level. That's kind of, permission to play. We could flip this thing on its head, and we can actually use this as an opportunity to create great cultures through great leadership and actually develop a competitive advantage for our organizations.
But what I'm hearing you're suggesting, Pete, is that it's not transactional. There's a deeper side to this, and I think that's the crux of this conversation. And I know we shared this is take us so because I've been in organizations, you have too, where you focus on the compliance, you focus on the transactional stuff, and yet you still have the problems. They don't go away. So, and that's where the beliefs come in.
Great. Well, thanks. Thanks. And yes, we've spoken a bit about the what. My last 25 years and what I've tried to do is integrate the work I've done in leadership, culture, and safety with some best practice and talk about the how we made that transition in those cultures. So I'm just going to share my screen for a moment. And what I'd like to share with the audience is just a blueprint. And it starts at the bottom. So the base of this is, can you see that? Are we all thumbs up?
We can. We've got your whole, so it's,
there we go.
That's better. Yeah, much better. Yeah. Perfect.
So at the base, we've got our organized, this is the foundation. There is no point even thinking of making change without the foundation. And for me, my three foundational beliefs around this, where we look at psychosocial hazards as an opportunity and not a risk, my three beliefs are you can't be well and unwell at the same time. Now, it's a bit like Eric Holnagel in safety. You can't be safe and unsafe at the same time. The second belief, drawing on the ANZ work, is that people actually do have the capacity to be complete at work. They may not have all the skills at the moment. They may be struggling with languishing and life issues, but people have the capacity, is the belief. And the third one that I mentioned based on the Oxford research is that well-being needs to be defined at an organizational level. Now, if we hold those beliefs as an organization, then what would our leaders be doing and how would they be behaving? So there are a number of pillars here. And the first one, just again, some guiding principles. What would leaders do who held that belief? Well, the first one, rather than seeing people as a problem to manage and control, they would see people to be included and valued and ask them to contribute their ideas. There'd be consultation, there'd be involvement. The second principle for leaders would be to be focused on creating the presence of positives, as opposed to trying to avoid the negatives. And the third principle for leaders really is to be clear on what contributions are required from all parties here so that everybody's got skin in the game. I'm conscious of where we are at time, so I'm just going to run through the framework quite quickly. So we hold these beliefs. We need to hold people accountable. I remember John McFarlane at ANZ, when we rolled out the new culture program, called his chief executive group together and said, here's where we're going as an organization based on these beliefs, and here are my expectations of you as leaders. Now, if you feel you can't live up to these guiding principles, feel free to, you can leave today. I'll give you a glowing reference. But if you stay, here are the consequences of not leading by these principles. So a very, very powerful thing. The second thing is around intrinsic motivation. And there's a lot of work done. Dan Pinker wrote a great book called Drive, says that the old school style of leadership, command and control, you know, carrot and stick, reward and consequence, so that'll get you basic compliance, but that's about all it's going to get. What you need for full engagement with your people is not the extrinsic motivation, but the intrinsic motivation. And he outlines three core parts to that. The first one is purpose. The second one is autonomy. And the third one is mastery, or learning, growing, developing, etc. Interesting that the ANZ program was all built about perform, grow, and break out, so mastery. When you look at intrinsic motivation, and I look at the 56-page code of practice around psychosocial hazards, central to a lot of the hazards is lack of autonomy, a lack of say, a lack of control over my work. So if we flip that into intrinsic motivation and we provide autonomy, then we're actually creating the presence of positives there. That's all good.
Sorry, it's interesting, Pete. It's interesting, Pete. And interesting, there's this real challenge around employee engagement, and engagement really is intrinsic motivation.
Yeah.
And yet organizations seem to think that, a lot of organizations think that, you know, free pizza, subsidized gym memberships, and flexible working but that doesn't create intrinsic motivation. That's sort of almost window dressing. It's not getting at the core of people. What you're sitting here is that unless you can have that, you get inside people's core, they're not going to have this drive.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, autonomy, growth, mastery, purpose are just key functions of the human condition and human sustainability. So we talk about that, but then really, how does that make sense to people? So there are two parts to this, and the skills that I teach leaders are around communicating with sense making. I use a lot of work from Simon Sinek, who wrote The Power of Why. We need to do X, Y, Z so that, you know, here's the benefit if you do it, here's the cost if you don't. But also from a well-being perspective, there's some great work that's been done by Genevieve Hawkins, who's a psychologist in Melbourne. She wrote a book called Mentally at Work. And she goes, why would I engage with this as a team member or an employee? What's the benefit for me? So she talks about the chemistry of the brain, and we have 4 chemicals in our brain, you know, cortisol, oxytocin, serotonin, and dopamine. And each of these, because they're in our brain and we're the CEO of our own brain, we have control over those, and we can adjust those. And so from an organizational perspective, I think, well, if we create more inclusion in the workplace, that's going to boost someone's level of oxytocin. If people feel valued, that boosts their level of serotonin. Now you go to these psychosocial hazards, guess what? Lack of reward, lack of recognition, lack of feeling valued are all listed as hazards. You think about dopamine, which is not just about achieving success, but it's about growth, learning, and development. If we're going to institute new initiatives, why would people want to engage with? Well, here's the benefit from our own brain chemistry. When I do this, you know, diversity and inclusion, you know, I really sometimes get challenged where everyone meets their diversity quotas, and I say, well, how included are those people feeling? Because when people feel included, up goes their level of oxytocin. So that's the third kind of filter that we run any initiative through. And then the fourth one really is being absolutely clear on roles, because everybody has skin in the game when it comes to this. So I've looked at the organization, and there are 3 things the organization needs to do here. Number 1 is define and communicate a positive well-being and psychosocial belief and the measures. So we need to be clear on what is our belief as an organization, and why does it make sense. Secondly, as an organization, we need to define what success would look like. And then thirdly, we need to commit sufficient resources to make this happen. That's the organizational role. ANZ, the program, 38,000 people, 14 years, tens of millions of dollars. The infrastructure program I've just run, 2 years, back-to-back workshops all over the country. So it's not just about the defining of the belief, but it's communicating the resources. When it comes to leaders and their role, the first thing we need to do is create a workplace environment of psychological safety where people feel safe to speak up. And there's a lot of work on that, and I could talk to that for a long time. The second thing that leaders need to do is set individuals up for success and personal accountability. I do believe we need to hold people accountable, but we can't do it if we haven't given them clarity, confidence, the resources. We've consulted with them. So, and the role of a leader is to actually set people up for success. And the third one would be to shift from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation. What about the team member? Now, I believe the team member has a role to play here too and has skin in the game. And there's a lot of talk around entitlement and learned helplessness, etc. I look at the psychological contract quite simply as this. I, as an organization, would employ you and pay you a good salary. I have a duty of care to provide a safe working environment. In exchange for that salary that you're earning, you need to show up fit for work. Now, we check that at a physical level with drug and alcohol testing, but how often do we check that people are mentally and emotionally fit for work? And if they don't have the skills, can we teach them the skills to do that? And then finally, because I am conscious of time, the positive measures. So if we're not focusing on avoiding the negatives, what are the positives that we want to create? And there'd be lots of anecdotal measures, there'd be lots of surveys and statistics and metrics. For me, go back to your people and say, if we were to eliminate the psychosocial hazard, how would that look in the workplace? How would we know? Because people have got the solution. I think in consultation with your team, leaders set the focus, leaders set the tone, again, based on beliefs. And the large transformation I've been working with the last couple of years, where as an organization, they have gotten rid of the TRIFA, the absence of negatives, as a measure of safety, and their measure is now the presence of positives. That's a very courageous move to make as an organization. However, an external audit has shown that their performance is through the roof. So they've had the courage to do that, where the leader sets the tone, the leader sets the focus. So that being the case, if you were sitting there now and you've got a 56-page document full of psychosocial risks and hazards, how on earth am I going to manage these? Then, and clearly this is a very high-level blueprint. There are a lot of skills and applications that sit behind the 5 pillars, but part of this is a template as well, which, with a couple of prompts and questions, you know, the hazard or the initiative that you would write in at the top, you've got somebody who's working in monotonous, repetitive work on a production line. That's now a psychosocial hazard. So what are you going to do about that? Are we going to do job rotation? Are we going to have people working in teams? Could we send that person on a training course to develop further skills that they could share with the rest of the organization? We're sitting and thinking about all these things. So walking through the pillars, you know, here is a template or a guideline that says, okay, when I'm dealing with this initiative or this change process, let's start with the guiding principles. How are we going to apply them so that everyone feels valued and can contribute their ideas? What are we going to do? What are some of the positives we want to achieve from this process, this project, this initiative, this team activity, this procedure, etc., and what contributions are required from everyone? That being said, thinking about motivation, then, how can we create more purpose or autonomy or mastery for the individual or the team that's involved with this hazard, this change, this initiative? Well, now I need to engage them. So what's the sense making? Where's my so that? What's the benefit here? And how is this going to impact me personally in terms of my neuro-brain chemistry? Okay, well, we're about to move forward here. So what are the roles of the organization, the leadership, and the individual in this particular thing? Because we're all in this together. And finally, what will we be looking for as evidence of the presence of positive? How are we going to measure this? What are we going to measure? So it's a very simple template that I've put together, but certainly a number of my clients have found it very helpful